What's happening, everyone? Recently, with the nice weather and not having been there for quite some time, we thought it would be great to head to downtown Chicago and check out some of the new exhibits at the Field Museum.
Welcome to
Jackie,
museum.
who's awesome,
What up, Jackie?
gave myself, Dennis, Trey, Christina, and Wes a guided tour. Now, this next part is going to be a little bit different. We were fortunate enough to mic Jackie for the Native Truth exhibit. I do want to put a disclaimer out that I'm not that knowledgeable about the field and what's showcased. While I tried to edit it to the best of my understanding, please be aware that I may have messed something up or misrepresented something. It's entirely unintentional. And with that out of the way, let's begin.
You ready?
We're ready.
All right, well, welcome to Native Truth. This is our new exhibit. It opened May 20th, and we were working on it for 4 years, so this is a big work in progress. We worked with over, I think, 130 Native collaborators on it, and we had an advisory committee of, I think, 11 Native American scholars, museum professionals, community leaders who helped guide us through the whole thing. So we just gave them a blank slate, like, here's the hall, help us build it, and they built it from scratch with us. This first area was done by Santiago X, who's a contemporary artist. The statement in front that you're on native land, which is from like a native clothing designer, and you'll probably see that on clothing from like REI. He worked with REI for a bunch of clothing line. And then as you walk through here, your silhouette will give different native words on the screen. So as you walk through, it'll kind of give you different tribal bands and different names. We have a little sensor here and projector up on the ceiling, showing that you're on native land. So he has a lot of kind of immersive environmental elements here, with poetry being read aloud. And then the interactive, he did 3D scans of items in our collection that don't have any provenience. So this is stuff that people collected, and we don't really know where it came from or who it belonged to. And he kind of wanted to ask the question, like, should the museum have these items even if we don't know where it comes from? There's one really cool, like this basket. So they 3D scanned these with our conservation department, which is pretty cool. It's like one of the first times we ever did like a 3D rendering of stuff. And then this first section here is about ancestors and what they left us. So the first case on the right is Karen Ann Hoffman's beadwork. She does Haudenosaunee raised beadwork. She's from Wisconsin, so she's Oneida. Those folks moved over from New York, and now are in mostly the Green Bay area, but she's from Stevens Point, Wisconsin. And she talks about beading around the kitchen table and what it means to her to bead. And she kind of talks about how beading is the connection to her ancestors and her mother and grandmother. All of these are items in the collection, but the pillow, the rocking chair, and the mat over there are new accessions. So we're still collecting. A lot of stuff we started in 1893, but we're still collecting. And a lot of stuff in this hall is new stuff to our collections. We integrated a video game for people to try. It's called Never Alone, and it talks about this little child and her fox friend going through the Arctic and kind of the adaptations to the environment. And then the rest of the section talks about kind of art and ceremony. So this first case is Reuben Ironhorse's ceramics. So he uses Oneida ceramics. So the ceramics in the front are from archaeological context, and he uses them to inform his artwork now. So the full pots in the back are his contemporary work, and the sherds in the front are things found in more historic context. So you can see how they're kind of similar. He draws upon that. And his community is the Iowa, and they're connected to the Oneida, the Oneida is like more like an archaeological term for the material culture, and it's around like 1200 AD, so they can track their ancestry back that far. And then this is his ceramic work that he does with traditional clay sources, but also more contemporary works too. And there's one video, him, firing his artwork, which is kind of cool. So he uses a contemporary kiln, but he also will use traditional firing too. So this is his contemporary stuff, and it's him actually making the dipper. We gave some artists GoPro cameras, kind of let them go out and film whatever they wanted to. And so this is him firing that ladle in the case. And then he shows kind of the traditional, let's see, yeah, the traditional kilns too. So this is how ancient folks would have been firing their ceramics, in a low fire kiln, kind of like this. And he starts off with just like a little tiny fire and then builds it up, and you can see on the pots the smoke coloration on them. It's from firing them, which is kind of cool. This case is all about Muskogee stomp dance, and above here there's video that talks about these 4 cases, but this one it'll show the stomp dance. So this is like an ancient ceremony, and those are the traditional rattle shells that they would use with box shell turtles. And contemporarily though, when they got displaced from where they're originally from, now that they're out in Oklahoma, these rattles, leg rattles, are made from the rations that are given out by the American Indian Bureau of Indians. So kind of a lot of people describe it as like poverty food or, reservation food. It's a really interesting connection to more traditional rattles and how they were traditionally made, and then what happens to ceremony when you're displaced and have contemporary materials and, kind of a newer story to tell. All right, let's head into this pod. So each of these little pods in the gallery have a different small story that will eventually rotate. This one is about Frank Waln, who is a Lakota rapper and flute artist. Kind of talks about his experience as a contemporary artist, about his fans and his community, about his family. He was in the hospital and experienced institutional racism, where he awoke from being in, I think under like anesthesia, and kind of freaked out when he woke up from anesthesia. He didn't know where he was, and the clinic treated him as hostile and tied him down, and it was really traumatic for him. So that story, this case over here, talks about his experience with that and how Native Americans have been treated that way in the past and were sent to mental asylums and sent to boarding schools to try to get rid of the Indian in them. And also in this case, which is really interesting, are 2 dictionaries, and it also talks about language revitalization. So like this is an older Lakota dictionary. You can see how small it is. And then this is the 2nd edition. So it's about like revitalizing language and, actually recording elders who can speak it, who are fluent. And that is kind of throughout Native America, people trying to recover and relearn language and spread it throughout their community. Mostly because it was frowned upon and even punished by the US government, and there were laws against speaking American Indian languages. So now people are free to study that again, so you can see that it's coming back, which is common in almost every community. And then in this area, if you all want to try it out, you can make your own mix of a beat with Frank. And this is kind of like his sound studio with his quilts. So this pod is about revitalizing basket weaving in California. So it's about Cahuilla basket weaving. And it talks about the specific individual basket weavers who were instrumental in keeping that tradition alive. And all the colors in the baskets are the natural fiber colors. So if they want to change colors, they'll change like the grass and the specific blade of grass that they're using to weave. And if you want to try your hand at weaving, you can weave your own little basket, starter basket here. So this section talks about the Field Museum and our history with collections, and kind of asks the question, should we even have this stuff that's here? So the first section over here talks about repatriation. So this was at a time late 1800s, early 1900s, when anthropologists were going out and just taking stuff because they thought Native Americans were disappearing. So they would just go into communities, sometimes even steal stuff, grave rob. This is an active, I don't think it's active, but it's stuff that could possibly potentially be repatriated, and kind of talks about, should we have taken this stuff out of the community? And a lot of times, like early when when anthropologists were going in and stealing stuff, we have to return that stuff back. The Native American Graves Repatriation Protection Act was passed in the 90s, and with that, it gave kind of a pathway for Native Americans to request their materials back. And so that's what our repatriation department does, is go back, figure out, did an individual give us something when it was community owned, like they didn't have a right to give it to us, or did we steal it, or did somebody else steal it and then give it to us? So that's kind of what repatriation does. It's a very small department of 2, but they're very, very busy, and they work on those claims, and it all goes through a legal federal process, and there's federal monies that go with it. So that's kind of what this section talks about, is should the museum even have some of this stuff? And then going down this way, it talks about Native American staff members at the field who have impacted the way that we care for collections. So this first one is a dress made by Maisie Lone Dog, and when Mavis, who is here, was working at the museum, she recognized that this was all one set and wanted to reunite the set in collections. So she made this mount for the dress and the leggings and the moccasins so that it could finally be back together as one piece. And her story kind of talks about what it was like being a Native American working here and trying to improve the collection storage of items, because we have tons of people who come to collections, like Native American artists and community members, government officials who come and use the collections, and we want things to be stored in a respectful way. Otherwise, it's really traumatic for people to come in and see their heritage being mistreated. So that's kind of the impact of Native staff on collections. And then this talks about kind of how we do collections access nowadays, where we have all these artists coming in and they look at things in the collection. So Chris Papan and Jalin Edenshaw, Chris came in and looked at our ledger art, and that influenced the painting behind here. And then Jalin Edenshaw looked at our form line and other things in our collections, like this carved wooden spoon. So he's Haida, and wood carving, horn carving is really important to their community. And so he is a wood carver. There we go. And so he came and visited the collection, and then we accessioned the bowl behind there. So we work with artists and we work with communities now. Instead of going and taking things from the community and having an anthropologist decide, what do we want in the collection? Now we work with artists to get contemporary art, or work with communities to say, what do you want in collections to tell your story? And it ends up being, we don't have the volume of stuff, but we have stuff with really rich stories, and we can interview people and have oral traditions or oral histories that we can put together with items. So if another artist comes in 50 years, they can actually hear from these artists and hear how they use the collections and how they use traditional, maybe iconography or something in their work. So this is kind of all about the field. And then the middle section here, it was really important that the middle section was about Chicago. So this talks about the American Indian community in Chicago and the American Indian Center here, which is the oldest Indian center in the country. And so it talks a lot about establishing community in an urban setting. A lot of Native Americans were displaced through the Allotment Act, which broke up their land and forced it to be given to specific families, and then from that, people living in poverty were selling off their land to make money. And because they were selling off their land, they started moving to the cities. And also because of poverty, they came to the cities for work. And so that's why you find in cities a large American Indian population, because Native Americans were moving here because of those kind of displacement acts. So this section really talks about how did they keep up feasts? How did they keep up dancing? The 1960s, when they had a canoe club and canoed down the Chicago River. and then what they're doing today. So kind of showing them throughout the years and showing them today and how they're thriving and have powwows and a vibrant community, and they're still here and they're your neighbors. All right, so the next section talks about sovereignty, native sovereignty. So there's over 500 sovereign tribes in the US. So think of them as separate countries. So we have separate countries within our country. And these talk about the sovereignty of those nations. So like this is the Navajo Nation. That's their flag and iconography on their flag, what it means. This is some of their artwork that they make and their right to be here, that their connection to the land and their connection to tradition. The next case, surprisingly, is dinosaurs. So I said I didn't know anything about dinosaurs, but I do know stuff about these specimens. They are from the Standing Rock Reservation, and the Standing Rock Sioux were the first community, first nation to pass a resolution that any fossils coming off their land had to stay on their land. Paleontologists could not come in and take stuff away. So these are Edmontosaurus toe and mandible, and then T-Rex teeth, and then fossilized ammonite and pine cones and amber that all come from the reservation. So in order to get these things here, we needed a tribal resolution to be passed for them even to come off tribal land. And they were really excited about it because they want people to know about their collection. They want people to know that they can come research it. They want paleontologists to know that, hey, we have this stuff and we'll loan it out to you for you to do research. So they were really excited about this, and I got to work with them, which was very cool. And I don't know if they have any pictures of them digging, but this is their museum. They have a little museum on their reservation land. Continuing with sovereignty, this case talks about wampum and wampum belts and kind of the symbolism of wampum belts and how they're basically like a treaty. Wampum belts usually were made as some sort of political agreement. The ends are always left undone because it is a symbol of an ongoing agreement, that this is not finished, that we, could add to this agreement at some time. And then at the back, there are peace medals. They were giving things as peace or political kind of iconography to Native Americans, to other communities, to show political agreements. And then it talks about how to make wampum, but this was really important, especially like the Revolutionary War, like George Washington was given a wampum belt. So this is really like an important political kind of act, is to make these, or kind of a political identity, a group identity would be this wampum belt. And then continuing with the sovereignty idea, this talks about Ada Deer and her involvement. She's Menominee, and her involvement in kind of the political realm. She was the first Secretary of Indian Affairs. This and the flooring is actually from Menominee Forestry. So they are one of the oldest and best forestry companies, and they do it through their tribal enterprise. And so this piece is related to the floor, same wood that the floor is made out of, and it documents the Menominee people throughout the history of the tree. So it talks about Ada Deer and her life, and it also talks about the Menominee and logging and the pressures for Menominee to sell their land, and they were like, no, we're not doing that, and instead now have a thriving forestry business because they did not sell their land to the lumber industry, which was obviously very powerful in the late 1900s. And then the last two cases finish up the story about sovereignty. So this one is about the stand-up society headdress. Women wear these headdresses. The very cool thing about this is, so it came into the collections in the early 1900s, but some folks from the society came and they worked directly with conservation to almost completely dismantle this headdress, clean it, reassemble it, repair it, and to stabilize it so that it could be not only on display, but that we could preserve it for more generations in the future. And then lastly, this quilt is by Gina Adams, who's a contemporary artist, and she uses antique quilts, and on top of that puts broken treaties. So this is the Broken Treaty of Chicago, and it talks about things that were promised to Native Americans, like a lot of treaties were like, you can still hunt and fish on here and use your traditional ways. ways. And then after years and years and years, slowly encroaching, those rights were taken away. So you'll hear a lot about like treaty rights and land rights, and that's what that's talking about, is things that were guaranteed as part of those treaties that then the U.S. government took away or settlers approached on, and those treaties were broken. So this section talks about Chaco Canyon, which if you see in the atmospheric pictures on this side, it's a very, very old pueblo. It's also a national park, and this entire section talks about tradition, talks about traditional arts like woven quilts and their symbolism and their tradition of making them, ceramics, and kind of what's going on now in Chaco Canyon, where they've been fighting to not allow any oil leases on the land. So it's federal land that they lease out to oil companies, which obviously is not good for the environment. And a lot of, especially Native American activists have been fighting against this. So it's this pod talks about kind of the history, the ancient ancestors who lived there, and the continuity, the knowledge, the art, and the traditions that are still alive today that people still practice. So there's still this connection to the land, and things like oil, mining is not great to continue having the resources to do traditional arts. This one's a turkey feather blanket. It's just a small section, but those are all turkey feathers. And then the blanket next to it is rabbit fur. So it's a rabbit fur blanket with wool kind of integrated into it. Talks about connection to land. So first it starts with a large map that talks about the removal of Native Americans from the Midwest and what it was like for folks to be forced out, the different wars and government removals that happened, and kind of plays that all out across a map. And then, so if you're talking about people's tradition and connections to place, if you're being removed, especially removed to like a completely new environment, like you don't have the same plants, you don't have the same animals that you have, oral traditions and traditional arts that are connected to. So those traditions are threatened by forcibly removing people from their land. And then going this way, it kind of talks about how people have continued their connection to land. So this first case features the Gun Lake Potawatomi up in Michigan, and they have kind of a DNR, Department of Natural Resources. Because they're a sovereign country, they have their own DNR, and their DNR work to keep the sturgeon population revitalized. So this kind of talks about sturgeon, wild rice, and about black ash basketry. They have ash baskets. Here is a historic one, and then this one here in the little vitrine is a more contemporary one. But you'll notice that there's metal in this one, and that's because there's an invasive species that's eating and just devouring all of the ash trees. So the theme kind of throughout this case is, how environmental change impacts tradition. So environmental change is threatening wild rice population, it's threatening sturgeon population, and it's threatening black ash trees and their ability to harvest the traditional things that they use for traditional basketry. Another basket case is talking about the Chitimacha, who are down in Louisiana. And so the front baskets are the older historic ones that we had in collections. And then the back three are ones that we just brand new accession to the collection. So you can see the continuity of tradition, of knowledge, of technique, and the continuity of how people are still today practicing traditional artwork. This one is, we worked with a school up in Canada, which is a native school, and their students made these artworks on the back based on and kind of influenced from the roll-up bag in front. So again, an example of how we have items in collections and we have folks accessing them and then making art that is based off of them, and continuing different art forms and oral traditions by allowing that access to collections. And then lastly, another Navajo case talking about the continuity of, again, artwork, connection to land, and how land is integrated into artwork. So like the Navajo rugs that are pretty well-known Navajo rugs, how they have oral traditions that are connected to it, but also the tradition of harvesting cotton and using cotton and wool to create blankets. At one point, they show baby sturgeons up top. You kind of have to wait for it. They're way cuter than you think they are.
Okay.
They look like little dinosaurs. Actually, it might be coming up. And we hung 2 canoes. There's one canoe in the Chicago space, and there's another canoe here. So that was new, getting canoes here, freezing them to make sure there are no pests on them, and then rigging them up. Oh, here's your baby sturgeons. So this is part of their Department of Natural Resources initiatives to regulate the sturgeon population, just because it is really overfished. All right, so this section talks about the Meskwaki of Tama, which is in Iowa, and it talks about their food sovereignty, and again, their traditions that are connected with food. So feasting, so those are brand new bowls that we had made for the exhibit. Luke Capallo made those for us. We talk about maple sugar making and maple syrup making. So this, you can even see on this pot on the right where the maple sugar kind of boiled over at one point. And there's still sugar like inside of it, so it's very obvious that they use it for sugaring. And then these are all common things that are in the Meskwaki pantry. So corn, beans, squash, the 3 sisters, and maple sugars on the end there. Remember the bowl and ladle you just saw? These are historic versions of the same item. So you can see the continuity of tradition and artwork and woodworking. And it's all connected to feasting. And this shows some of their traditional beadwork and silver working. So the Meskwaki were also up here in Illinois and Wisconsin, and they did a lot of silver working, lead working. They were folks who the fur traders would have been talking with and meeting with here. So they were another community that got displaced, and part of them got displaced to Iowa or to Oklahoma, and then came back up to Iowa, so closer to home. But the couple videos in here kind of show what it's like to grow and process, their traditional foods. And Shelly Buffalo, who's in the video, talks about how processing food and growing food and doing traditional artwork, all these things can keep them connected to their ancestors. So that's kind of like a running theme throughout the exhibit. By continuing traditions, they're continuing connections to ancestors, they're continuing their identity, and it's all like fighting against all of these pressures from like the US government and from white supremacy that we're trying to force them to forget all of this. So the last section is called We Speak for Ourselves, and it features artists, poets, and a clip from Reservation Dogs, a TV show, to kind of show that Native Americans don't need anyone speaking on behalf of them. They can speak for themselves. They are still here. They're artists, continuing the stories and traditions of their communities. So kind of fighting against stereotypes and, people speaking on behalf of them, including the museum, a very white institution, speaking on behalf of them. Now we're kind of stepping aside to let Native people speak for themselves. And one thing that's really interesting in this case is the little booklet on the left is called Red Man's Rebuke, and it's written by Chief Pokagon, who the Pokagon band of Potawatomi is named after. And that was a little pamphlet that was distributed during the World's Fair. So while there was a World's Fair here with a bunch of white people putting on these displays of people, they literally had like almost kind of a human zoo where people were on display performing for white people. Chief Pokagon was walking around and handing this out saying, we're still here. This is who we are. We're still here. We don't need you speaking for us. And the artwork next to it is from Jason Weesaw, who's from the Pokagon band of Potawatomi. And it's an old chair from a church. And this work kind of is talking about how, you know, there was a lot of missionization, there was a lot of pressure from various churches to assimilate native peoples. And he's kind of saying, like, we don't need to sit in churches anymore. We don't need to have a Western identity anymore. We're free to go back to our roots, to go back to our traditions. So it's a really interesting case of kind of the history of Pokagon Potawatomi and their ability to speak for themselves. And then the last items here are a piece by Preston Singletary. So this is a glass piece. So he uses height of form line, which we saw earlier, which is usually on woodworking, but he used it in glass. And he's in the Seattle area, so this one came from Seattle and is new to our collection, so that will stay here. And then this case is by Storme Weber, who is an author and spoken word artist. And this is a raincoat that was from her community. And you'll also see there's a little sign here that says this item was removed because it's inappropriate to display. There was never an item there, but they wanted to include an item in the exhibit, but they also thought it was possibly like a ritual or religious piece and thought it might be inappropriate to put on display. So they're also making a commentary about, again, how the field has stuff that maybe we shouldn't have or maybe nobody should see, and things that are so powerful that they will spiritually damage you if you come in contact with it, or if the wrong person comes in contact with it.
This horse actually.
And I don't know if you've seen Reservation Dogs, but this is a clip from it, and it's very good. It's on FX. And then the last section here is the Pawnee Earth Lodge. So we built this lodge with the Pawnee, I think in the 80s, I want to say. And it's been here for a long time, and we have kind of kept connections up with the Pawnee, but we really reached out to them and had them integral to not only interpreting the Earth Lodge, but also creating the cases outside. So they picked these items from the collection and some things from their community to talk about what it is to be Pawnee, that again, they're still here, and that Earth Lodges are still important to them, community gatherings are still important to them. These religious symbols are still important to them. So, and these are, again, everything in the hall are things that we will be updating. I think the first thing that rotates out is in 6 months. So things will be changing pretty regularly in the halls. We don't want it to be the same thing as last time where we didn't update anything since the 1950s. We don't want that again because things change. So that is the whole hall. You've seen it all. Yes.
So the Earth Lodge that you're visiting.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, if you want to continue your explanation, Laura.
Sure. And then here you can see the 4 poles are colored with 4 different colors. Those are the 4 directions and the colors that are associated with them. And then you could see kind of the beds and chairs around the outside with the hearth in the middle and the hole up top.
It sounds like you wrote them collate.
I did, yeah. I'm in exhibits registration, so I got everything here.
Nice.
And I was in Anthro Collections beforehand, so I have a little bit of both.
Yes, you do.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just delighted to have this video over here because it really helps to have them explaining it. It's such a
It
nice
does,
encapsulation
yeah.
of what we try to get across.
Yeah. And it's nice if no one's in here and people want to peek in and hear about it. Yeah.
And that brings an end to the Native Truths part of the video. Afterwards, we went to go check out the Jurassic Oceans exhibit, which for me is a lot of just kind of like, hey, look how massive these things are. Going to warn you ahead of time, I'm going to be butchering these pronunciations like left and right. It's not intentional. Like, it's going to be bad. Just a heads up. The exhibit opens up to some of the wild creatures that existed before the Jurassic period. Here we have a giant amphibian. It is a Paracyclotosaurus davidi. Sorry. And this ichthyosaur skull and ichthyosaur cast. Here we see some fossilized shells in coral reef. Cool to see horseshoe crabs have been chugging along since the age of the dinosaurs. And I wish you could see how massive these teeth were. Because you can put your hand next to it, it's kind of hard to show. Here we have a Hypodus. And, this fossil cracked us up because it is a fish that died choking on eating another smaller fish. And that's how it's going to be remembered in history. This was a Hypsocar munsingus. This was a Hypsocar munsingus that was around during the Jurassic period. Here we get to feel fossilized poop, or a cast, I hope. For an example of size that is a lot easier to show, check out this talon that the dinosaurs used to catch fish with. And look at the size of this ray. On some of the exhibits, they also had this fierce factor to show how vicious certain creatures were, and this poor one only scored a 1 out of 10, least fierce. They also had like a modern day dolphin skeleton, so you could kind of easily compare to the ancient fish and mammals that are no longer around. This plesiosaur skeleton was just wild to look at. And like, check out how extensive its flippers are. A lot of cool shells, similar to the dolphin. Here's a crocodile that you can compare to. The big thing right there, that's a rib. This was a mosasaur skull, and it was terrifying. Here we get to see animals that were a bit more familiar and haven't seen such a drastic change since the time of the dinosaurs. This right here was an early whale skull, and then check out this early whale, the Durodon, Dennis for scale, and it's tiny, and I mean tiny, back feet. Also check out its teeth. That's a little more intimidating. I failed to get what it belongs to, but look at that jawline and West for scale. Also, here's Jackie and Christina for additional scale. Hope that helps. Once we were done with that, next on the docket was the wild color exhibit. This exhibit was broken down by color, and it showed where it would pop up in nature. Where does it show up on animals? Where does it show up on bugs? Where does it show up in plants? There was also this cool chair that we all took turns sitting in. I will be honest, I did consider this for the thumbnail. Now, the video itself, I don't feel is doing justice. I'm trying to make the colors pop a little bit more in the video, but it just can't compare to seeing it in person. The colors are really lush. Really being able to see the textures and layers makes like a world of difference. They had a lot of fun discussing things like animal camouflage, albinos, and even things that would be more visible or just more apparent with like ultraviolet light. This was an example of how animals could change the color depending on their environment and the time of year. The exhibit kind of wrapped up with like iridescent color palettes, and that's a visual treat. I really should have gotten more examples of that for this video. Sorry. It's a trip, and it's a lot of fun to see it broken down in this way. On our way to the Griffin's Hall of the Evolving Planet, we checked out the Quetzalcoatl Atlas statue. What has been a reoccurring theme here is that it is absolutely massive, to give you an idea of like how big this thing was. Also, Christina got it in a moldorama. Yeah, give me 1 second to adjust. Now, with the evolving planet, I wasn't able to capture all the awesome bits and pieces of information that encompassed it. But it is very cool to kind of walk through chronologically to see how the planet has grown and evolved. One thing that I think the exhibit does an incredible job is to illustrate how precarious and precious life is. After the first mass extinction, you would start seeing like plant life grow into prominence, and life begins to diversify in the changing climate. I would absolutely not want to mess with something that is of that size, and if you look at it, I'm pretty sure that bite would hurt a lot. So at this point, mass extinction 2 takes place with continental shift, causes like a huge loss of life. What happens is we enter in probably the most terrifying of eras, is the era of just massive bugs, just large creepy crawlies, flyers, and something I'm gonna be honest, I shudder to think about it. It was also the rise of different types of four-legged creatures. We have the skeleton of a skeleton of a Periosaurus, also this crazy spine of an Edaphosaurus. Look at this tiny head. Conversely, look at that massive head. Things are good for a while, then the third mass extinction takes place. The theory is that there was tremendous global warming with massive volcanic eruptions that form modern-day Siberia. This brings us to the Mesozoic era. Life in this era was wild. You look at all these shapes. It was also the rise of a little thing known as mammals. You know, things kind of important. And we reach mass extinction 4. And while we're not sure what may have happened, this wiped out a lot of earlier reptiles, but allowed the dinosaurs to become the dominant life on the planet. I recorded this segment here so I could say cash money dinosaurs. And that's it. That's really all the reason that is in here. While we've seen a lot of huge things so far, the dinosaurs just dwarf everything else. There wasn't really a place I could capture this sauropod skeleton in any way that I was really satisfied with. The Stegosaurus skeleton was super cool to see. Here's another example of how big the bones were. Tried to get the sauropod at a different angle. It didn't really quite work out. It's just tremendous to see in person. It's still massive. Christina helps provide an example of how large their feet were. And I apologize for the shots here. I thought the skulls were super cool, but I couldn't get a good view without the glare on the glass. Well, I think most people, myself included, think of dinosaurs. We imagine the ones that we see in Jurassic Park, more reptilian and scaly in nature, and this fossil and other evidence kind of indicates that they were feathered creatures. Here we have the Duspletosaurus, a smaller cousin of the T-Rex. Here we have a ceratopsian skeleton. Man, I am just butchering all of these. A Pachycephalosaurus, a Myhosaura, a Parasaurolophus, and Triceratops. I don't think they're called that anymore. I forgot to take notes. I don't know what that was, but that is a lot of fish. And I believe here is where kind of turtles make their first appearance. Now, we get to one of the most famous and improved exhibits, Sue. She's named after Sue Hendrickson, who discovered her in 1990, and it was a nearly complete T-Rex fossil. Now, Sue's head is actually stored separately in this container. This is for a few reasons. One, it's actually malformed over time, and the one that they use on display is a better representation of what Sue would have looked like when she was alive. The second is weight. I can't imagine trying to balance 600 pounds on a display. And then lastly, what we found out is it helps provide researchers with easier access, where they can just kind of come to this display, look at this tooth size. Here we are. Seeing Sue in person is awe-inspiring. Yes, even the tiny arms, especially the tiny arms. The size and scale are no joke. They even have this super fun series of displays that show Sue on the hunt. Look at all these like support items that they need to be used to kind of key Sue on display. With that out of the way, we now head into Mass Extinction 5, where a massive asteroid, stated to be the size of Manhattan, crashed into the planet, ending the era of dino dominance and ushering the age of mammals. While there are some wild evolutionary paths, we begin to see a lot more things that we recognize. Check out all these fossils. We have an alligator. We have all these bird fossils. We have more recognizable like fish shapes. This is an ancient whale skull. And here we get into early ancestors, early footprints. Here are some early tools and some early art. This is a primitive burial of a modern human, and the exhibit then goes into the Ice Age. If you've ever watched like the Ice Age cartoon, you're just like, oh, Sid is a sloth, but you don't realize how big giant sloths were. More Ice Age creatures like the saber-toothed tiger. Sorry, I forgot to get this animal's name, but it helps. Please look at this woolly mammoth. Look at this giant beaver. Which brings us to the latest mass extinction. This one kind of caused by humans. The counter on the number is the number of species that have gone extinct since the morning. Basically, right now, it's averaging about 30,000 a year. Animals go extinct. Our third ticketed exhibit, after Jurassic Oceans and Wild Colors, is the Cyrus Tang Hall of China. While I did have this exhibit in a vlog a few years ago, it was a fun revisit with friends. With 3,500 years of written history, there's a lot. There's a lot to cover with China. The beginning parts of the exhibit cover early China tools, pottery, and civilization. As time passes, craftsmanship and tools begin to improve, as you can see here, and here, and here. There are a ton of examples. I'm beginning to regret not recording more of the text, as I don't really have a lot of context to provide you in this particular video. You get to see kind of like the groundwork for the Chinese written language as we know it today. Now, preschoolers who study Chinese can run circles around me. Like, this is not even up for debate. But it was still cool for me and Christina as well, who can read some Chinese, to recognize and read some characters in like books that are well over like 2,000 years old. Shout out to Three Kingdoms period and the Dynasty Warrior games here. The amount of pottery, tools, and weapons in the exhibit is well worth it. Definitely cool checking out. I'm not doing it justice here. Check out this cheat sheet. Someone was trying to ensure that they passed the exam to become an imperial official. And it is extremely small, fine, and delicate writing. It's, unfortunately, because of the glass, I can't show it. But it's tiny, absolutely tiny. And there's a really fun part of the exhibit where there's a shadow puppet show. And depending on where you're sitting, you can either watch the show as it would be presented to an audience, or step behind it to see the behind the scenes. They also kind of talk of trade and exploration. with these chunks, and yeah, it was cool seeing it again. And with that, with little left that's in the batteries, both in my camera and us individually, we wrapped up with a bite at Ricobene's. Thanks for watching, and catch you in the next video.